I'm excited to share this next interview with you. Welcome, Stephanie Ghoston Paul. Stephanie shares about how grief lays the groundwork for other emotions to move through, the relationship between grief and joy, and the importance of making space to grieve in social change spaces. Stephanie Ghoston Paul is an internationally recognized speaker, facilitator, organizational development consultant, life coach, and recovering lawyer. She brings over 15 years of experience in advancing equity, fostering inclusive leadership, and sparking systems transformation using racial justice and healing frameworks. Stephanie's unique approach skillfully and wholeheartedly combines her sharp legal mind, problem-solving skills, and love of people to powerfully serve clients and challenge existing systems. She has coached leaders and staff in the nonprofit, for-profit, education, foundation, and public sectors to integrate equity and inclusion into the core identities of those organizations. She's well-versed in assessing organizational culture, tool building, and strategic coaching for equity. I hope you enjoy this interview.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hey, how are you, Michelle?
I'm good. For the people watching, I'm a little under the weather or listening today. So I'm good and happy to be here with Stephanie, with you. So thanks for joining me.
Yes, I'm so honored and I'm excited about this. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
We know each other from Portland, Oregon.
Portland, woo!
Right? Which was an experience. We worked together. So doing race equity work and training with organizations and communities. And that's when we met. And now we're in different places. I'm in North Carolina and you're in Atlanta.
Yeah, made a major move. Both of us. Michelle took the leap first. And then it was like almost a year. What was it? A year later. Yeah. Like almost a year later, I did the same.
A good change, big change and good change.
Yes. And I'm sure that'll come up later as we talk.
It will. It's totally going to come up in the conversation about grief and liberation.
Yes.
So I want to invite us to just take a moment to center before we dive into the questions. So you can find a comfortable way to be. And for folks listening or watching, you can find a comfortable way to be. And if you'd like to close your eyes, you can. And just take a moment to turn your attention to your breath. And begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And as you breathe, take a moment to notice how you feel physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Notice what is present for you. And take another few deep breaths here to prepare for the conversation, the sharing and listening. And when you feel ready, you can blink your eyes open.
Thank you. That's great. That's some great grounding.
Good. I'm glad. I would love for you to share about the work you do in the world.
Yeah. So I didn't know I was going to be asked this question, but as I was breathing, something came to mind that just makes sense. And I really just had an aha moment myself that my work in the world is to help people, communities, and companies get in alignment and embody their purpose. And so some of the work I do is individual coaching, and that's helping leaders to internalize their brilliance and embody the power and purpose that they've been given. For communities, it's more so around like healing and telling the truth in community. And for organizations, it's helping them take this commitment that they have on paper and actually embody that in their culture and in their identity. So all of that is in service of a planet where all people can be free, whole, and enough. And so that is the work that I do in the world.
Mm-hmm. You sound really clear about that.
Michelle, I literally, as I was like, it's about alignment and embodiment. Like I've never actually said that out loud before, which is really weird.
Well, I'm glad the aha came through and some clarity. The download came. Yeah. I'm curious to know, the first question is, why do you feel like it's important to center a conversation about collective grief and liberation? You know, that's the theme for this. So through your work, through your own lived experience, why is it important to center a conversation about collective grief and liberation?
Yeah, I don't think that as a collective we're conditioned to make space for grief. And we're not conditioned to see grief as a portal for liberation. And I think why now, I don't think that we're experiencing grief in a completely different way, but I think that people who haven't been attuned to their grief are, whether because of privilege or because of survival, some folks haven't been tuned into that grief. And I think some folks are desperate enough to try something new now. They're seeing how, when communities focus on grief, what can transform and shift. And so I think it's coming more into collective visibility. Whereas I think individuals, we've been grieving for years, like our ancestors, we have that DNA within us. But I think it's more so coming into the mainstream now. And as I think about where we are as a country, as a planet, for everything from environment to politics to racialized experiences, I think um, a, grief holds a space where we can step into liberation, and it's just not as explored by the collective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why do you feel like it's not explored by the collective or culture? That's part of what I hear what you're naming.
Well, I mean, from my own experiences, grief can be very painful. And I think that there's an association with like grief is bad. It's something to be done in private. It's like it's not useful for action. And I actually think the opposite is true. My experience is that grief like lays the groundwork for the other emotions that I want to experience. So the degree to which I can grieve is the degree to which I can experience joy and freedom and happiness and actually cherish that joy, freedom, and happiness because of the grief that I've experienced. And often I want to avoid it. Like I'm trying to not look at it or see it or experience it, but it's the very thing that will take me to the emotions that I do want to experience. And so my experience is avoiding it pushes it away temporarily, um, and it allows us to somewhat operate on autopilot with ourselves and with each other. But that energy goes somewhere. Like it's not just not going anywhere. It exists, and we have to do something about it. And it pops up in weird ways sometimes where you're like, where did that come from? Or why am I crying all of a sudden? Or this small thing happened, and all of a sudden, like I'm connecting it to a larger context. For me, that always means that there's something that I wanted to grieve, or that I could have stepped into grieving that I didn't, and now later it's coming up for me in another somewhat odd way. So yeah, I think just in general, it's not the portal that we typically choose, but it often is the one that we need to choose.
Is there a way you're choosing it now, right? Like in your life, is there a way you're stepping into or allowing that work to happen with the portal of grief so you can experience joy and liberation and ease.
Yeah, I think it's always great when you can do it voluntarily, where you're like, I have time and I'm going to set aside time. And then I think there comes a time where grief is like, hey, Stephanie, I've been knocking at your door. You've been ignoring me. And that's happened for me. I feel like this whole past year living in Atlanta has been a time of grieving. There's been a lot of newness that has emerged for sure. But I realized that I've been grieving lots of things in my life and lots of people and even places that I haven't been conditioned to grieve. So I think, and we've spoken about this before, as a society, I think grief is reserved for like death and loss, very concrete loss, and then also for like romantic relationships. So people are like, you broke up with so and so, this is a really sad time, take time for yourself. But we don't often grieve non-romantic relationships or non-familial relationships. We don't often grieve like work spaces that we leave. We don't grieve like cities that we leave. And I was thinking about it yesterday. I didn't grieve like the loss of my apartments that I've lived in, where I've shared wonderful memories and I felt safe and I felt loved and I felt cared for. So yeah, grief has made its way into my forefront, and then I've also made space for it to process some of that grief from those relationships, both people and to places. When I make space to grieve, I also have to make space for those emotions too, because it's how it shows up in my body, or as I let that grief express itself, it comes up as something else. So I've noticed when I've set aside time and I'll say like I'll name I'm grieving this, or I want to like really concentrate on this, other emotions come up that I haven't dealt with either. And that really takes me back to the moment or the moments that I kind of skipped over. So I'm almost like replaying it in my mind. What happened with this person, or what happened in this place? And I didn't take time to move through whatever was happening then. And now I definitely have to take time for those emotions now. So that's those two have been probably the biggest lessons. I think grief also can be a space for joy, which I think in the last few years I've experienced that. I think I intellectually knew that, but it wasn't something I had experienced until this year. And figuring out like, what does joy actually make space for? And as I mourned Portland or this workspace or an old friend, I also was literally in my heart, in my body, in my mind, making space for new folks, new friends, new memories, new opportunities, new places. And so I realized that like coming to Atlanta, I couldn't fully be here and be with the people here and the work that's here until I let go of some of that old stuff. And it's been fascinating to see how instant it is, like taking time to make space, and like the next day, the next hour, the next week, someone's coming into my life, or an opportunity is coming into my inbox, or something is moving and shifting because I actually made space. So I think those have been the lessons that have been most impactful for me. And again, it's been through experiencing rather than reading about or hearing from other folks. And I think the last thing I'll say is, this past year, I've worked really hard to center myself and center my own grieving, and learning like it's hard for me to step into collective grieving if I haven't done my own work first. And so last year I really wanted to like, let me develop this collective, let's figure out how we heal in community, let's do this. I was doing a lot of self-care as resistance work. And I realized like I cannot be in those spaces unless I do my own work. And that's where I feel like it almost feels like a responsibility to me, and not in like a burden or obligation way, but as part of the contract of me being in these various communities, I have an obligation, I have a responsibility to show up and do my own work so that I can contribute to that group. And sometimes I need to step away from that group so I can do my own stuff, and then I can come back. And thankfully, my communities have been really open to that. to different folks taking space, stepping away to do their own work, and then coming back. But as I think of collective grief, I'm just thinking of the collective responsibility, how we're holding each other in community. Folks can step out, step in as they need to, but we're also addressing the harm and the loss in community as well.
Yeah, and I, given that we worked together and I think worked in a space where there wasn't room to grieve or even think about how we could be free as we were doing the work. I'm just wondering if you could share some about like what you've noticed in that space or other spaces
Hmm?
what's the cost, right, when we don't actually make space to grieve?
Yeah, it's, I feel really strongly about it now. I actually think that, especially in social justice, racial justice spaces, it's more rampant than we think. That organizations who are doing the work externally, and they can recognize systems that are happening externally that they're trying to help other people combat, they're impacted by those same systems. And so I feel really strongly that those organizations should not be doing that work if they don't take the time to do that internal work. Like, to be doing the external without the internal is really, really harmful. And so I've been in that workspace, the workspace we shared, other workspaces, and even working with organizations up until now, where um, some of the cost is relationship. Like, we're not in right relationship with each other. So it's hard for us to do the work because we got mess between each other. We can't show up as our best self because there's parts of us that we're not allowed to express. And it's like we're jumping over or completely ignoring or not allowing that to come into the space. And there were times where that was very present. Like, that's not allowed here. You can't do that here. Do that on your own time. You need to show up 100% and looking like this, right? That was 100% whiteness. um I think the folks who else suffers is the people who are on the receiving end of the services. Like, I think about how stepping into a space and not being my whole self was not serving the people that I was facilitating, because they weren't getting the real of what was happening. And I also at the same time was feeling so conflicted, like, if I really am real about how I'm feeling today, am I going to jeopardize my position at this organization? And so, yeah, I'm just harm on so many levels. I think um I think it breeds mistrust, right? Again, because we're not being authentic, we're not telling the truth, we're not living in our truth. And I've really seen it be just destructive. I think that when people have to come to work in a place where they feel like they should be able to be themselves and they can't, there's a huge it's hugely disappointing. I think that was part of my grief too, is like, sometimes we're grieving a concrete thing that we lost. Like, I'm sad because our friendship no longer looks like how it looked. But sometimes we're also grieving the expectation of something. Like, someone promised, this is how things are going to be, this is how it's going to run, here's what you can expect from me. And that gap between the what was promised and what is the reality creates some grief too. There's a loss there. And so I think, again, on the other side of that, it's like I was grieving how I was treated, how folks were treated, but I was also grieving like how it could be, or maybe should be, or the potential of this thing. And so, yeah, I just think harm on so many levels. I think mistrust, I think, is destructive, and I think it ultimately impacts the impactfulness of the work if we can't fully embody the change that we say we want to see. Like, we know these systems have impact on our bodies. We have to take care of that. Part of that is grief. Um, and it's hard to model something. It's hard to expect someone to do something when you're not modeling it. And so I think that I've seen organizations kind of flow through or kind of do surface level stuff or talk the talk, but the real deep rooted, sustainable, long term shifts are not happening because we're not doing the holistic work. And I think grieving is, it's embodied work, it's heart work, it's some of it is head work. But if you're not in alignment or in tune, it's going to be hard for you to do that work. It's like, I don't know. So, I remember a couple examples of people like saying, how can we expect other people to do things that we're not doing? And how can we walk someone through a process that we haven't processed ourselves, right? Like, and again, I think it's rampant. I think of organizations that I've worked with. I think of opportunities that have come my way. Some have happened on a very national scale, right? You see these articles of like something blew up, a whistleblower, someone who says like, man, this is how we've been treated. Yeah, me too, me too, me too. Whether it's sexual harassment, it's whiteness and white supremacy, it's patriarchy, right? These things are blowing up. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like we don't have to do that. And I just think that's so unfortunate.
Yeah, and you're talking about on the organizational level or in spaces where people are organizing and doing work around justice or racial justice or trying to create equity. And I'm wondering what, just based on your experience and the things you've named about grief, what it would look like on a collective scale for us to prioritize space to grieve in order to find some liberation or ease or, access to freedom.
Mm-hmm. I think it would look so different. I think it requires slowing down. We actually have to slow down enough, get off of autopilot. And I think just those two things could fundamentally transform our society. Like, imagine if someone asked you, Michelle, how are you doing? And we slow down enough to not only hear the answer, but for you to give a genuine answer, right? But like, we don't even have time. It's like, how are you doing? How are you doing? Oh, I'm good. I'm good. Or I'm tired. Like, even if we give a sliver of the truth, it's usually tiny, right? What if we were like, no, really tell me, how are you doing? And I want to know, and I want to hear the whole thing. Like, think about the investment in that relationship and how we can support each other and the empathy that comes out of that, right? I think about like how we do meetings, right? How we start meetings and we just jump in, and or even this one, like we got grounded first, and like the difference that made, just something so small, so tiny, brought so much clarity for me. Like that was clarity. That was like clear. And so I think our public and private spaces would look fundamentally different. I think about like conferences where, stuff is happening and you need time to process. You're like, hold on, I have to like let go of this thing and I'm trying to make it fit into this thing. Like, I've seen conferences where they've got healing rooms or like nap rooms or support rooms. Like, we would fundamentally change how we interact in public and in these private spaces. And I think we would start to organize around those. Like, instead of, and I'm not saying it's either or, but I just think about like Saturdays are like farmers market days. What if Saturdays were like gather in the public square days? I have a former colleague in DC. She does these like sidewalk talks, and they're just therapists that set up on the sidewalk, say hi, sit down, you have a question or you want to talk. We would literally be using public spaces very differently. And I think that on an individual, collective, and like systemic level, that would shift a lot of things. That would, people getting that grief out, talking about it, being validated, hearing rituals, ways to move through, like that would be revolutionary if we started that in our culture. So I think it would make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned ritual. So are there rituals or practices you engage to move through grief or to move it through, like your body or emotional state?
Yeah. So one, I'm just gonna plug your cards. Your grief deck has been really helpful for me, especially this year. And I think it was in October is when I did it. I just took a whole like half a day, so like 6 hours, to engage in a ritual with the grief deck. And I used different formations. I wrote letters. I burned some things. I did a lot of crying, and I did move emotion during that day, but I need to move emotion out of my body. And so I find time to, whether it's like laying in my bed and like cocooning and like doing some rocking, crying. Sometimes it's like just telling the truth, and it might just be to myself. I do that through journaling. Like, how am I feeling about this? Why am I feeling this way? What are the other emotions that are coming up? It's been through conversation too, where it's like sometimes I'm looking for validation, sometimes I'm looking for healing in community. So a lot of these harms are perpetuated in community, so we want to heal through community as well. Sometimes it's not engaging, and again, I'm not saying that avoiding grief is bad or good or whatever, but I think it is a survival tactic, and it's a coping mechanism. Like, right now I don't feel like I have the time and space, or it doesn't feel safe here in this time and space to have this reaction. And so I want to protect myself until I get to a space and a place that feels safe. And I've done that quite a bit, where something may be happening in public or in a public space that I don't feel particularly tied to or safe, and I need to get to the comfort and safety of my home. I think co-regulating is wonderful. I love hugs and cuddling, whether it's platonic or romantic, like with a partner, or just like giving someone a good long hug. Like, that feels really good. On Wednesday, last Wednesday, I was at an event and hadn't seen someone in a long time. And just her giving me this long hug. She had this beautiful jumpsuit that she had made for her. And it was a sad moment, but it was to get that hug was it felt so good. It felt so good. And I even texted her, I was like, Lee, thank you so much for that hug. It was so great. Um, so those are some of I will say again, I love burning things. So writing letters and burning them, or just like um, items that I want to get rid of or let go of. I've done that a lot. Clothing, cards, a symbol of something, someone, or a place or a space has been really instrumental for me. I think I'm just drawn to fire in some ways, so um, I'll leave that there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, when you came to visit me, we talked about being witches and
We
reluctant
did.
was your
Reluctant. I'm very reluctant. I'm a reluctant witch. Yes. I'm saying it out loud. I'm a reluctant witch. Yes.
and from what you're describing, you're definitely engaging in ritual and magic and burning things and clearing things. And I'm here for it. I love it. So part of what led me to initiate this conversation about collective grief and liberation is my own frame of feeling heartbroken most of the time about what's going on in the culture. And I'm wondering if you can share, and you've shared some about this, more about how grief can help us actually, space to grief can help us move through heartbreaking times.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a common and probably conditioned response to everything that's happening. First of all, it's overwhelming. It's like this thing, and then this thing, and then our own stuff, and then our ancestral stuff. So it's like all around their stuff. And I think one common reaction is like apathy, like, I can't deal with anything, or numbness, right? Or we're trying to survive, so we're like blocking out this and blocking out that. And I think, again, while it's a coping mechanism and not bad, good, whatever, it does disconnect us. And I think that's the piece where when we don't grieve, we're disconnected from ourselves, from our experience, from our body. And then that also leads us to be disconnected to other people. So I can't fully be with you if I haven't even been with myself and all the stuff that's going on. And so I actually think that grief and the emotions associated with it, anger, outrage, sadness, whatever it is, help us move into some kind of action that starts to liberate ourselves and other people. So I think about, like, when I'm avoiding, I'm in inaction. Like, I'm like, oh, I just can't even, not this week, not today. But experiencing that heartbreak and sitting in it is like, oh, this feeling, like I'm feeling something based on what's going on, and I want to eventually do something. I might not do it right away, um, but it keeps me connected to my experience, to the issue at hand. And I often think like, so I feel like grief is paired with remembering, like literally remembering. And when we don't grieve, we forget the past, right? We pretend like it didn't happen or we gloss over it. So remembering is bringing to mind what has happened so that we can continue to fuel ourselves going forward. I think it's so important. And then that word like literally remembering is connecting ourselves back to our bodies. So I think grief is crucial to that. We need it.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful that what you said about remembering, because often I'll say remember to remember. It makes me think of that. And like how you're naming that remembering has to do with connection and coming back to ourselves and each other. And it's like coming home. And I always say remember to remember because we have the capacity to remember. Culture makes us feel like we have to forget or lie about what's going on, right? Or, only not feel, but like move from the neck up, right? Instead of like in a full bodied way with emotions and the full range of emotions.
Yeah. And that too, you just made me think of it's remembering. I love that. Remember to remember. I'm remembering that you would say that. And also, it's just a call to like, there are nuances. Like, it's not like grief is like one dimensional. Like, this was just bad. Like, or this person, this relationship. Remembering to remember helps us look at the full range, and it also helps us like, where were we in that? Like, where was I? Like, what was I doing? How was I contributing? Like, where was I not saying no or setting boundaries? How was I complicit in letting this get to where it got? And so again, remember to remember is like the full range of the things, because I think we also can get stuck in like that one lane. It was just this thing, and it typically is not.
That's right. Usually it's more than one thing or multiple things, right? There are many emotions and ways of being and responding. Yeah. So what does collective liberation mean to you? What would that look like? What does it mean to you?
Yeah. So I named it a little bit before. I think collective liberation is looking at how all of our experiences are tied to another. And there's all kinds of quotes about that, how my liberation is tied up in yours. But again, I think most of the time, even when we're individually impacted, there's a community or collective impact to the harm that we've experienced. So it's not just me and my body, it's going backwards and forwards. Like I'm passing that on to whoever I'm partnered with or whoever I might, if I have children. um and there's a collective impact, like me, my body as a Black woman, that has an impact on the collective of Black folks and women identified folks. So I think it's about our experiences being bound up in each other. And I think again, it's about that responsibility, that collective liberation means that individually we're doing our own work, and as part of all these communities that we're part of, friends, family, workspaces, education, whatever that community is that we're part of so many. We have a responsibility to do our work for ourselves and for that community. I see too often people not doing their work and slowing folks down. You're slowing us down. Do your own work, right? And knowing that if we as a collective are committed to that healing and that grieving together, that we can hold when someone needs to step out and do their own work, and can come back in. We need you refreshed. We need you rested. We need you healed. We need that. We don't need the sick version, the version that's avoiding. We need the person that's fully embodied, that's fully here. We need those folks. So yeah, and I think, like I said in the beginning, my hope is that we get to a place where collective liberation to me means my work is a service of everyone being free, whole, and enough. So being free to dictate your existence and what you want to do, to know that you have all the things that you need and you're whole, and that you're enough, like you show up enough and your enoughness makes space for other people. I think that's the ultimate goal for me.
That's powerful. Yeah, powerful work and a powerful practice to be in. So I would love for you to tell people how they can find you, and also like what's coming up in 2020 that you want us to know about.
Yes, so my individual work, I talked about coaching. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Cultivated Sense, CultivatedSense. And so that's mostly my individual coaching pieces. LinkedIn is where I do all my institutional work and organizational work. So you can find me on LinkedIn under my name, Stephanie Ghoston Paul, and Cultivated Sense. And then what I'm so excited for 2020 about, which is my new communal offering, is called Take Nothing When I Die. And it is a movement to remind people that we are living ancestors. So we don't have to wait till we're old or some mythical someday to think about what's our legacy. We have time now. In the present, we can create a legacy. And so I'm dropping a podcast in January. So by the time this airs, it should be out on all of the platforms that you love: Anchor, Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, all those things. It's called Take Nothing When I Die, and it will be interviewing folks who have managed multiple careers in one lifetime. So learning from the wisdom that they've gained in those roles and even in their trajectory. Because I think most of us now, not a lot of folks are like, have one job for the rest of their lives. It's mostly like side hustle and entrepreneur life and the slash career people. You'll be hearing from folks like that. And then there will be a Patreon page. And so the Patreon page will house the videos from the interviews. And also it will be expression of my own living ancestry. So you'll hear from a little bit more from me than you'll hear from me in the podcast. So yeah, now Take Nothing When I Die on Patreon. It's just patreon.com/TNWID. And then Take Nothing When I Die will be on all podcast outlets and also on Twitter and Instagram. Yeah.
I went to your Patreon yesterday, and people should go visit it and support Stephanie and the work that she's doing in the world, because it's powerful, and it's real. I think it's just a different way or frame to think about ourselves as living ancestors, instead of like, we're gonna die and then our legacy will be present, but really to be thoughtful about the way we're living now, every minute. So support Stephanie and her work. And Stephanie, thank you for today's conversation and for showing up and sharing. And it's nice to connect with you. So thanks for saying yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love speaking with you, and I love the questions, and I also love the topic. And I'm just really grateful that this is happening. So I'm hoping that folks enjoy the rest of the summit and continue to follow.
Thank you.